The desert wind carried whispers of death across the small frontier town of Crimson Ridge, Arizona Territory, in the autumn of 1887. Dawn was still hours away, but the gallows stood ready in the town square, its wooden frame casting long shadows under the pale moonlight. The rope had been tested twice, and the trapdoor mechanism oiled until it moved with silent efficiency. By sunrise, it would claim the life of a young Apache woman named Ayana, whose name meant eternal blossom in her native tongue, a cruel irony given her impending fate. Sheriff Marcus Whitmore stood at his office window, his weathered hands wrapped around a tin cup of bitter coffee that had grown cold hours ago. His grey moustache twitched as he watched the early gathering crowd. Word had spread quickly through the territory about the execution. Settlers, ranchers, and drifters had traveled from as far as Tucson to witness what many considered long overdue justice. The girl had been convicted of murder, though the circumstances surrounding the crime remained as murky as the desert dust that never seemed to settle in this God-forsaken place. 3 weeks earlier, the body of Samuel Morrison, a prominent cattle rancher, had been discovered on the outskirts of his property with an Apache arrow protruding from his chest. The arrow bore distinctive markings that tribal experts identified as belonging to the Chiricahua band, and Ayana had been found nearby, her hands stained with blood and her horse lathered with sweat as if from a hard ride. The evidence seemed damning, and the territorial judge had wasted little time in pronouncing sentence, but Whitmore had his doubts. In his 23 years of law enforcement, first as a deputy in Kansas and now as sheriff in this harsh corner of Arizona, he had learned to read people like the desert read the sky before a storm. There was something in the girl's dark eyes that spoke of innocence rather than guilt, a quiet dignity that seemed at odds with the cold-blooded killer the prosecution had painted her to be. Ayana sat in her cell, her back straight against the rough stone wall, her long black hair braided with strips of leather in the traditional Apache style. Despite 3 weeks of captivity, she maintained the proud bearing of her people. Her bronze skin had paled slightly from lack of sunlight, but her spirit remained unbroken. She spoke little English, and the court-appointed translator had been a drunkard more interested in his next bottle than in ensuring accurate communication between the defendant and her accusers. The cell block was quiet, except for the occasional snoring from Jake Henderson, a habitual drunk who had been arrested the previous evening for disturbing the peace. The smell of unwashed bodies and stale tobacco hung in the air like a suffocating blanket. Ayana closed her eyes and tried to transport herself back to the sacred mountains of her childhood, where the morning mist clung to ancient pines and the songs of her grandmother echoed through hidden canyons. Her grandmother, Cocheta, had been a medicine woman of great renown among the Chiricahua. She had taught Ayana the old ways, the songs that could heal wounded hearts, and the plant medicines that could cure most ailments. But Cocheta's greatest gift had been her ability to see beyond the surface of things, to perceive the true nature of people and events. If her grandmother was still alive, she would have known immediately that Ayana was innocent. But Cocheta had crossed over to the spirit world 2 winters ago, leaving her granddaughter to face this ordeal alone. The Apache way was to meet death with courage, to sing one's death song with pride and dignity. Ayana had composed her song during the long nights in her cell, weaving together memories of her childhood, gratitude for the beauty she had witnessed in her 22 years of life, and forgiveness for those who would end it prematurely. She would not give her executioners the satisfaction of seeing her beg or break. Outside, the crowd continued to grow. Merchants had set up makeshift stalls, selling food and drink to the spectators, turning the execution into a grotesque festival. Children ran between the adults' legs, their innocent laughter a stark contrast to the grim purpose that had brought everyone together. Women in their Sunday best clutched their husbands' arms and whispered behind gloved hands about the savage Indian girl who would finally pay for her crimes. Among the crowd stood Thomas Brennan, a man whose appearance marked him as different from the typical frontier settler. His clothes, though dusty from travel, were well made and expensive. His boots were crafted from fine leather, and his silver pocket watch caught the lamplight as he consulted it frequently. But it was his eyes that truly set him apart. Pale blue and intense, they seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing of his thoughts. Brennan had arrived in Crimson Ridge the previous afternoon, claiming to be a cattle buyer from back east. He had taken a room at the Frontier Inn and spent the evening in the saloon, listening to the locals discuss the upcoming execution with a mixture of bloodlust and self-righteous satisfaction. He had asked few questions, but those he did ask were pointed and specific. Where exactly had the body been found? What was the girl's tribal affiliation? Did she have any known relatives in the area? Now, as the pre-dawn hours ticked by, Brennan found himself drawn to the jail. He approached the building with the casual air of a curious visitor, but his steps were purposeful and his gaze sharp. The deputy on guard duty, a young man named Billy Cartwright, who was barely old enough to shave, looked up nervously as the well-dressed stranger approached. "Morning, deputy," Brennan said, his voice carrying a slight accent that Billy couldn't quite place. "Heard there's quite a spectacle planned for sunrise." Billy puffed out his chest, trying to project authority he didn't feel. "Yes, sir. The Apache girl who killed Sam Morrison. Gonna hang her proper like. Sheriff says it'll send a message to the other tribes about what happens when they mess with white folks." Brennan nodded thoughtfully, his eyes drifting toward the jail's barred windows. "Mind if I take a look at her? Never seen a real live Apache up close. They say they're fierce as wildcats." The request made Billy uncomfortable, but he was reluctant to refuse such a well-dressed gentleman. After a moment's hesitation, he gestured toward the building. "I suppose it couldn't hurt. She ain't going nowhere, and she'll be dead in a few hours anyway. But keep your distance from the bars. Sheriff's orders." Inside the jail, the sound of their footsteps echoed off the stone walls. The lamp Billy carried cast dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and twist like living things. When they reached Ayana's cell, the young Apache woman looked up with eyes that held no fear, only a weary resignation. Brennan studied her face carefully, noting the high cheekbones, the proud set of her jaw, and something else. A subtle similarity in the shape of her eyes and the line of her nose that stirred a long-buried memory. He felt his heart begin to race as pieces of a puzzle he had been trying to solve for 20 years suddenly began to fall into place. "What's her name?" he asked quietly. "Ayana, I think. Means something fancy in Apache. Sheriff might know more about it." Brennan stepped closer to the bars, ignoring Billy's nervous warning about maintaining distance. When he spoke, it was in halting but recognizable Apache, words he had not used in decades. "Ayana, daughter of the mountain winds?" The girl's eyes widened in surprise. Few white men spoke her language, and even fewer spoke it with the accent he carried, an accent that suggested he had learned it not from books or brief encounters, but from living among her people. She studied his face more carefully, noting the sun-weathered skin, the pale eyes, and something familiar in his features that she couldn't quite identify. "You speak the tongue of the Chiricahua," she said in Apache, her voice musical despite the circumstances. "How does a white man come to know our words?" Brennan's hands gripped the iron bars as memories flooded back, memories of a different life, a different name, and a love that had changed everything. "I lived among your people once, many years ago, in the sacred mountains, when Cochise still led the warriors and the soldiers' forts were far away." At the mention of the great chief's name, Ayana's expression shifted subtly. Cochise had been dead for more than a decade, but his memory was still revered among the Apache. Only someone who had truly known the people would speak his name with such reverence. "Why do you come to stare at me like the others?" she asked, switching to English so that Billy could understand. Her accent was thick, but her words were clear. "Do you also hunger to see Apache blood spilled on white man's ground?" Before Brennan could answer, Sheriff Whitmore's voice echoed through the jail. "Billy, what's all this noise back there? Folks are starting to gather outside and I need you helping me keep order." Billy shot a nervous glance at Brennan. "Sorry, mister. I got to go. You'll have to look at the Savage girl some other time." As the deputy's footsteps retreated, Brennan found himself alone with Ayanna for the first time. The moment felt charged with possibility and danger, like the air before a lightning strike. He looked at her intently, searching her face for confirmation of the suspicion that was growing stronger with each passing second. "Tell me about your family," he said softly in Apache. "Your mother, what was her name?" Ayanna hesitated. The white man's interest seemed genuine rather than morbid, but trust did not come easily to someone facing death at dawn. Still, something in his voice, a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the harsh treatment she had received from other whites, made her want to answer. "My mother was called Morning Star. She died when I was still small, no bigger than a coyote pup. The fever sickness took her during the winter when the snows came early and stayed late." Brennan felt the blood drain from his face. Morning Star, Tala Hosteen in Apache. The woman he had loved with every fiber of his being, the woman who had taught him to see the world through different eyes, the woman he had been forced to leave behind when the army came searching for him. "And your father," his voice was barely a whisper. Ayanna's expression hardened. "My mother never spoke of him. The other women said he was a white man who took what he wanted and left like smoke on the wind. I was born of shame and raised in shadow." The words hit Brennan like physical blows. He gripped the bars so tightly his knuckles turned white. After all these years, all the searching, all the wondering what had become of the woman he loved and the child she might have carried, he had found his answer in the most terrible way possible. "Your mother," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Did she have a mark here?" He touched his left shoulder, a small scar shaped like a crescent moon. Ayanna's eyes widened. The scar had been there as long as she could remember, and her grandmother had told her it came from a childhood accident. But how could this stranger know such an intimate detail about her long-dead mother? "How do you know this thing?" she demanded. Brennan closed his eyes, and suddenly he was 23 years old again, lying beside Tala Hosteen in the hidden cave where they would meet, tracing that small scar with his finger while she laughed and told him stories of her childhood. He had been a different man then, with a different name and a different life. The army had known him as Private Michael Brennan, but Tala Hosteen had called him by the Apache name she had given him, Sikis Ki, which meant friend of eagles. When he opened his eyes, Ayanna was staring at him with an expression of growing recognition and disbelief. In the lamplight, she could see past the lines that 20 years had carved in his face, past the grey that threaded through his dark hair, to the young man her mother must have known. "It cannot be," she whispered. "I was a soldier then," Brennan said, his voice breaking, "stationed at Fort Apache. I was supposed to be scouting Apache movements, reporting back to my commanding officer. Instead, I fell in love with your mother. We met in secret for almost a year. I wanted to desert, to stay with her, to make a life among her people. But before I could, there was trouble. Someone had reported my unauthorized activities to the army. They came looking for me and I had to run. I tried to get word to her, tried to come back, but it was too dangerous. I thought she would be safer if I stayed away." Ayanna felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The father she had never known, the man whose absence had marked her entire life, was standing before her in her final hours. The cruel irony was almost too much to bear. "She waited for you," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Grandmother told me that much. She waited until the snows melted and the flowers bloomed, but you never came. She never took another man to her blankets, never spoke your name aloud after the first year passed. She raised me alone and died alone, carrying your memory like a sacred burden." The words cut through Brennan like Apache arrows. He had made his choice 20 years ago, had convinced himself it was the right one. He had built a new life, accumulated wealth and status in the white world, always telling himself that Tala Hosteen was better off without him. Now he saw the consequences of his cowardice laid bare in the face of his daughter, a daughter who would die because he had not been there to protect her. "I've spent 20 years trying to find you," he said, "searching for any trace of her, of the child I thought she might have carried. I had investigators check every reservation, every Apache settlement. I never found a record of a morning star or a daughter named Ayana. We lived with the wild bands," Ayana explained, "the ones who refused to go to the white man's reservations. We moved with the seasons, never staying in one place long enough for your investigators to find us. It was only when the soldiers finally caught our group 2 years ago that I was forced to live among whites." Brennan felt a cold fury building in his chest as he thought about the circumstances that had brought his daughter to this moment. "Tell me about the night Samuel Morrison died. Tell me exactly what happened." Ayana wiped her tears with the back of her hand and composed herself. If this man truly was her father, he deserved to know the truth before she died. "I was returning from gathering medicinal plants in the desert. It was late, nearly dark. I heard gunshots coming from the Morrison ranch, and then I saw smoke. When I got closer, I found the rancher's house burning. There were men riding away, but it was too dark to see their faces clearly. I found Morrison lying in his yard with the arrow in his chest. He was still alive, but barely. He tried to tell me something, but his voice was too weak. He died while I was trying to help him." "Why didn't you ride for help?" "I was afraid. I knew how it would look. An Apache found with a dead white man and a tribal arrow. I should have run immediately, but I couldn't leave him to die alone. By the time I decided to go, the sheriff and his men had arrived. They found me kneeling beside the body, my hands bloody from trying to stop his wounds." Brennan nodded grimly. The story made sense, but it wouldn't matter to a jury of white men who had already made up their minds about Apache guilt. "Did you recognize the arrow? Was it from your band?" "No, the markings were wrong. It was made to look like Chiricahua work, but whoever made it didn't understand our ways. The fletching was bound with sinew from a deer, but we use hawk feathers and bind them with plant fiber. It was a crude imitation, meant to deceive white eyes." This confirmed what Brennan had suspected from the moment he heard about the case. Someone had murdered Samuel Morrison and framed an innocent Apache girl for the crime. But proving it would be nearly impossible, especially with the execution set for sunrise. The sound of voices outside grew louder as more spectators arrived for the dawn hanging. Boots echoed on the wooden sidewalks, and somewhere a drunk man was singing an off-key version of Camptown Races. The carnival atmosphere made Brennan sick to his stomach. "There has to be something," he muttered, pacing the narrow corridor like a caged animal. Some evidence that was overlooked. Some witness who saw the real killers. Ayana watched him with growing amazement. After a lifetime of believing herself abandoned, she was witnessing her father's desperate attempt to save her life. It was too late, of course. Dawn was less than 2 hours away, and the law in Crimson Ridge moved with the swift certainty of desert justice. But the sight of his pain, his obvious love and regret, filled a hollow place in her heart that had ached for 22 years. "It does not matter now," she said gently. "I have made peace with my death. Knowing that you didn't abandon me willingly, knowing that you searched for me, that is enough. I can die with dignity, knowing I am not truly alone." "No." Brennan's voice was fierce with determination. "I won't lose you again. I won't let them murder you for a crime you didn't commit." He began pacing again, his mind racing through possibilities. He had money, influence, connections throughout the territory. But none of that mattered in a place like Crimson Ridge, where territorial justice moved according to its own brutal logic. Then he remembered something, a conversation he had overheard in the saloon the previous evening. A drunken cowhand had been bragging about some recent cattle rustling activity, mentioning that certain ranchers had been targeted because they refused to pay protection money to a group of local outlaws. Morrison's name had come up in that conversation. Brennan was sure of it. "I need to get out of here," he said urgently. "I need to talk to some people, ask some questions. But first..." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. Inside was a silver locket that had belonged to his mother, the only valuable thing he had owned when he was a young soldier in love with an Apache woman. "This was meant for your mother," he said, pressing the locket through the bars into Ayana's hands. "I bought it in Tucson the week before I had to run. I've carried it ever since, hoping someday I would find her and give it to her. Now it belongs to you." Ayana opened the locket and found a small photograph of a young man in an army uniform. The face was unmistakably that of the older man standing before her, and she felt a surge of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. "Thank you," she whispered, "for this and for coming back, even if it's too late." "It's not too late," Brennan said fiercely. "I promise you, daughter of my heart, it's not too late." He turned and strode from the jail, his mind already working on a plan that was equal parts desperate and dangerous. Outside, the crowd was growing larger and more boisterous. Someone had brought a fiddle, and the discordant music mixed with laughter and shouted conversations to create a grotesque symphony of anticipated violence. Brennan pushed through the crowd, ignoring the curious looks his fine clothes attracted. He needed to find the cowhand who'd been talking about cattle rustling the night before. He needed to locate any witnesses who might have seen riders near the Morrison Ranch. Most importantly, he needed to find a way to delay the execution long enough to uncover the truth. The eastern horizon was beginning to show the faintest hint of gray, the false dawn that came before true sunrise. Time was running short, but Thomas Brennan had not spent 20 years building a fortune by accepting defeat easily. Somewhere in this dusty frontier town was the evidence that would save his daughter's life, and he would find it if he had to tear the place apart with his bare hands. Back in her cell, Ayana clutched the silver locket and tried to find strength for what was to come. The knowledge that her father had not abandoned her willingly changed everything and nothing. She was still going to die, but now she would die knowing she had been loved, knowing she was not the shameful burden she had always believed herself to be. The rope was waiting, and dawn was coming, but for the first time in weeks, Ayana felt something other than resigned acceptance. She felt hope, fragile and probably doomed, but real nonetheless. Her father had found her at last, and if anyone could work a miracle in the time that remained, it would be the man who had spent 20 years searching for the daughter he had never known. As the first real light of dawn began to creep across the desert, the stage was set for a desperate race against time, a confrontation with long-buried secrets, and a reckoning that would change the lives of everyone in Crimson Ridge forever. The Apache girl, who was to be executed at sunrise, had found her father, but whether that discovery would save her life or simply add one more tragedy to her story remained to be seen. The gallows waited in the town square, its rope swaying gently in the morning breeze, while somewhere in the growing crowd, a well-dressed stranger with pale blue eyes began the most important investigation of his life, a search for truth and justice that would either reunite a family torn apart by time and circumstance, or witness the final heartbreaking chapter of a love story that had begun 20 years too late. Chapter 2. Secrets in the Shadows. The Dusty Rose Saloon was the kind of establishment that never truly closed, where the last drunk of the evening often became the first customer of the morning. As Thomas Brennan pushed through the batwing doors, the acrid smell of stale tobacco and spilled whiskey assaulted his senses. The floor was sticky with decades of accumulated filth, and sawdust that had once been white was now a sickly brown color that crunched under his boots. Behind the bar, a massive man with arms like tree trunks was mechanically wiping down glasses with a rag that looked dirtier than the vessels themselves. His name was Pete Kowalski, a former prizefighter from Chicago who had drifted west after one too many blows to the head had left him with a permanent tremor in his left hand. The tremor didn't affect his ability to break up fights or eject unwanted customers, and in a place like the Dusty Rose, those skills were more valuable than his bartending expertise. 3 customers occupied the establishment at this early hour. A grizzled prospector sat slumped over a corner table, his beard stained with tobacco juice and his clothes reeking of sweat and unwashed wool. Near the window, a card, sharp in a rumpled suit, dealt himself hand after hand of solitaire, his fingers moving with practiced precision despite the obvious effects of a night spent drinking. And at the far end of the bar, nursing a glass of rot-gut whiskey, sat the man Brennan was looking for. Jake Murdoch was a cowhand of the worst sort, lazy, dishonest, and possessed of a mean streak that manifested itself most clearly when he had been drinking. His face was a roadmap of hard living, scarred by countless barroom brawls and weathered by years of hard desert sun. His clothes were dirty and patched, and his gun belt showed the kind of wear that came from frequent use rather than mere show. The previous evening, Murdoch had been holding court at a table full of equally disreputable men, spinning tales of cattle rustling and protection rackets with the casual arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable. He had mentioned Samuel Morrison by name, laughing about how the stubborn rancher had refused to pay what Murdoch called insurance money to certain parties who preferred to remain unnamed. Now, in the pale light of pre-dawn, Murdoch looked considerably less confident. His bloodshot eyes darted nervously toward the door every few seconds, and his right hand rested close to the butt of his Colt revolver. When Brennan approached the bar and ordered a whiskey, Murdoch's entire body tensed like a coiled rattlesnake. "Mighty early to be drinking," Brennan observed casually, sliding onto the stool next to Murdoch. "Must have been quite a night." Murdoch grunted non-committally and took another sip of his whiskey. Up close, Brennan could see that the man's knuckles were scraped and bruised, as if he had been in a recent fight. More importantly, there were dark stains on his shirt sleeves that looked suspiciously like dried blood. "Name's Thomas Brennan," he said, extending a hand that Murdoch pointedly ignored. "I'm a cattle buyer from back east. Heard there's been some trouble with rustlers in these parts." At the mention of rustlers, Murdoch's eyes sharpened with interest and suspicion. "What's it to you, mister? You ain't looking to buy cattle from rustlers, are you?" Brennan laughed and shook his head. "Lord, no. Just the opposite. I need to know which ranchers I can trust to deliver what they promise. A man in my position can't afford to do business with anyone connected to unsavory activities." "Smart man," Murdoch said, relaxing slightly. "There's been plenty of unsavory activities around here lately. Why, just last night..." He caught himself and clamped his mouth shut, suddenly realizing he might be saying too much to a stranger. "Last night?" Brennan prompted gently. Murdoch shook his head and finished his whiskey in one gulp. "Nothing, just saloon talk. You know how it is." But Brennan had caught the slip, and he pressed his advantage. "I heard Samuel Morrison had some trouble with rustlers. Shame what happened to him. Though I suppose it's not surprising considering." "Considering what?" Murdoch asked, the words out of his mouth before he could stop them. "Well, I heard he was a stubborn man, the kind who might refuse to cooperate with certain business arrangements. Sometimes stubbornness can be dangerous in a place like this." Murdoch's face went pale, and his hand moved instinctively toward his gun. "Who've you been talking to, mister? What business arrangements?" Brennan raised his hands peacefully. "Easy there, friend. I'm just a businessman trying to understand the local situation. A man hears things, you know. Talk about protection money, about what happens to ranchers who don't play along with certain groups." The cowhand's eyes darted around the saloon, checking to see who might be listening. The prospector was still unconscious, the card sharp was absorbed in his game, and Pete the bartender had moved to the far end of the bar, where he was stacking bottles with deliberate concentration. "You didn't hear nothing from me," Murdoch said in a low, dangerous voice. "And if you're smart, you'll forget whatever you think you heard about Morrison or anyone else." "Of course," Brennan agreed. "But I'm curious about one thing. That Apache girl they're hanging this morning seems like awfully convenient timing, doesn't it? Morrison gets killed, and within hours they have an Indian to blame for it." Murdoch's reaction was immediate and telling. His face flushed red, and his hand closed around his whiskey glass so tightly that Brennan thought it might shatter. That savage got what she deserved. She killed a good man, and she's gonna pay for it. "Did she, though?" Brennan asked quietly. "Or did someone just need a convenient scapegoat?" The question hung in the air between them, like smoke from a gun barrel. Murdoch stared at Brennan with naked hostility, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow. For a moment, it seemed as though he might draw his weapon right there in the saloon. Then the batwing doors swung open and 3 men entered who changed the entire dynamic of the conversation. They were cut from the same cloth as Murdoch, hard men with cruel eyes and the kind of casual violence that came from years of living outside the law. Their leader was a tall, angular man with a black beard and a scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. His name was Clem Hawkins, and he was the unofficial boss of every illegal enterprise within 50 miles of Crimson Ridge. Hawkins surveyed the saloon with the proprietary air of a man who considered himself above the law. His gaze lingered on Brennan for a moment, taking in the expensive clothes and the soft hands that marked him as an outsider. Then he turned his attention to Murdoch, and his expression hardened. "Jake," he said, his voice carrying the flat menace of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. "We need to talk." Murdoch practically jumped off his stool, his face showing a mixture of fear and guilt that confirmed every suspicion Brennan had harbored about the man's involvement in Morrison's death. "Sure thing, Clem. What about?" "Not here," Hawkins said, jerking his head toward the door. "Outside." As the 4 men moved toward the exit, Brennan made a split-second decision that would either provide him with the evidence he needed or get him killed. He threw a coin on the bar to pay for his untouched whiskey and followed them out into the grey pre-dawn light. The men had gathered in the alley beside the saloon, where the morning shadows provided cover from prying eyes. Brennan positioned himself behind a stack of empty barrels, where he could hear their conversation without being seen. The wooden slats were rotted and full of gaps that allowed him to observe the group while remaining hidden. "You stupid son of a bitch," Hawkins was saying, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "I told you to keep your mouth shut about last night, but according to Sid here, you were running it like a broken gate all evening long." One of Hawkins's companions, a stocky man with missing front teeth, nodded eagerly. He was telling everyone who'd listen about the Morrison job, bragging about how easy it was, how the old man never saw it coming. Murdoch's face went white. "I never said nothing specific, Clem. Just general talk, you know? Nothing that could hurt us." "Nothing that could hurt us?" Hawkins repeated, his voice rising dangerously. "You mentioned Morrison by name, you fool. You talked about protection money and what happens to people who don't pay. And now there's some fancy-dressed stranger asking questions about the whole business." Brennan felt his heart rate increase. They were talking about him, which meant they had noticed his interest in Murdoch. He needed to hear more, but he also needed to be prepared to run if they discovered his hiding place. "What stranger?" Murdoch asked, though his guilty expression suggested he already knew the answer. "The one you were just talking to in the saloon," the 3rd man said. He was younger than the others, probably no more than 25, but his eyes held the dead emptiness of a born killer. "Pete told us all about your cozy little chat, said the man was asking mighty specific questions about rustlers and protection rackets." Hawkins stepped closer to Murdoch, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. "What did you tell him, Jake? And don't lie to me, because if I find out you've been running your mouth, you're going to join Morrison in the ground." "I didn't tell him nothing," Murdoch protested, but his voice cracked with fear. "He was asking questions, sure, but I didn't give him no answers. I told him to mind his own business and forget what he thought he heard." "What he thought he heard about what?" Hawkins demanded. Murdoch squirmed under the intense scrutiny of his companions. About protection money, about what happens to people who don't cooperate." The sound of Hawkins's fist connecting with Murdoch's jaw echoed through the alley like a gunshot. The cowhand staggered backward, blood streaming from his split lip, and nearly fell over a pile of garbage. "You worthless piece of trash," Hawkins snarled. "Do you have any idea what you've done? We had the perfect setup. Morrison's dead, and in less than 2 hours that Apache girl is going to hang for it. Case closed, no questions asked. But now you've got some stranger poking around asking questions about protection rackets." "Maybe we should kill him too," suggested the younger man. "Make it look like an accident. Say he got thrown from his horse or something." Hawkins considered this for a moment, then shook his head. Too risky. He's obviously got money and connections. People like that don't just disappear without someone asking questions. We need to be smarter about this. So what do we do? Asked the stocky man with missing teeth. First, we make sure Jake here understands the importance of keeping his mouth shut from now on, Hawkins said, delivering another vicious blow to Murdoch's midsection that doubled him over in pain. Then we keep an eye on this stranger. If he gets too close to the truth, we'll deal with him. But for now, we stick to the plan. The Apache girl hangs at sunrise, and that's the end of it. Brennan had heard enough to confirm his worst fears. These men had murdered Samuel Morrison and framed Ayanna for the crime, but he still needed more specific details if he was going to convince Sheriff Whitmore to postpone the execution. He shifted his position slightly, trying to get a better view of the group, and his elbow knocked against one of the barrels. The sound was small, barely audible, but in the tense silence of the alley, it seemed as loud as a church bell. All four men turned toward the sound, their hands moving instinctively to their weapons. "What was that?" Hawkins whispered, his eyes scanning the shadows. Brennan held his breath and pressed himself against the back wall of the alley. His heart was pounding so hard he was sure they would hear it, and sweat trickled down his spine despite the cool morning air. Through the gaps in the barrels, he could see Hawkins gesturing for his men to spread out and search the area. The younger killer moved toward Brennan's hiding place with the fluid grace of a predator. His gun was already in his hand, and his finger rested on the trigger. He was less than 10 feet away when the sound of running feet echoed from the street beyond the alley. "Clem!" a voice shouted. "Clem, you out here!" The newcomer was a boy of perhaps 16, dressed in the rough clothes of a stable hand. He skidded to a stop at the mouth of the alley, his chest heaving from exertion and his eyes wide with excitement. "What is it, Tommy?" Hawkins demanded, holstering his weapon and stepping away from the barrels where Brennan was hidden. "It's the sheriff," Tommy gasped. "He's asking questions about you and the boys. Someone told him you were seen riding near the Morrison place the night the old man got killed." Hawkins cursed viciously. "Who told him that?" "Don't know for sure, but I heard it was that new deputy, Billy Cartwright. Seems he remembered seeing you and Jake and the others heading out of town that evening, and it got him thinking." This news seemed to galvanize the group into action. Hawkins grabbed Murdoch by the shirt front and hauled him to his feet. "This is your fault, you stupid bastard. Your big mouth has brought the law down on us." "What do we do now?" asked the stocky man. Hawkins was quiet for a moment, his mind working through the implications of this new development. "We stick to the story. Morrison was killed by the Apache girl, and we were nowhere near his place that night. Anyone who says different is mistaken or lying." "What about the stranger?" the younger man asked. "We deal with him after the execution. Right now, our priority is making sure that Apache girl swings at sunrise. Once she's dead, the case is closed, and even if someone has suspicions, they won't be able to prove anything." The group began to disperse, with Hawkins issuing final warnings about keeping their stories straight and their mouths shut. Brennan waited until he was sure they were gone before emerging from his hiding place. His clothes were torn and dirty from pressed against the rough wall, but he had obtained the confirmation he needed. The problem was that confirmation alone wouldn't be enough to save Ayanna. He needed hard evidence, something that would force Sheriff Whitmore to postpone the execution and reopen the investigation, and he had less than 90 minutes to find it. As he made his way back toward the main street, Brennan's mind raced through the possibilities. The men had mentioned being seen riding toward the Morrison ranch on the night of the murder. If he could find witnesses who could place them there at the right time, it might be enough to cast doubt on Ayanna's guilt. But first, he needed to warn Sheriff Whitmore about what he had discovered. The lawman had struck him as fundamentally decent, if perhaps too quick to accept the obvious explanation for Morrison's death. Faced with evidence of Ayanna's innocence, Whitmore might be willing to delay the execution long enough to investigate further. The crowd around the gallows had grown larger and more boisterous as the execution approached. Someone had started a betting pool on whether the Apache girl would cry or beg for mercy. A vendor was selling roasted peanuts and lemonade, turning the grim proceedings into a grotesque carnival. Children who should have been in school were running between the adults' legs, their innocent laughter a stark contrast to the purpose that had brought everyone together. Brennan pushed through the crowd, ignoring the curious looks his disheveled appearance attracted. The sheriff's office was located directly across from the gallows, as if to emphasize the connection between crime and punishment in Crimson Ridge's frontier justice system. He found Sheriff Whitmore standing at his office window, staring out at the growing crowd with an expression of weary resignation. The lawman looked older than his years, worn down by decades of dealing with the worst aspects of human nature in a place where civilization was a thin veneer over barely controlled chaos. "Sheriff," Brennan said, bursting through the door without ceremony, "I need to talk to you about the Morrison murder." Whitmore turned slowly, his tired eyes taking in Brennan's torn clothes and urgent expression. "Mr. Brennan, isn't it? The cattle buyer from back east. What's your interest in a matter that's already been settled by the courts?" "It hasn't been settled," Brennan said urgently. "The wrong person is about to be executed. I have evidence that Ayanna is innocent." The sheriff's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, a spark of interest, or perhaps hope. "What kind of evidence?" Brennan quickly related what he had overheard in the alley, describing the conversation between Hawkins and his men in detail. As he spoke, he watched Whitmore's face carefully, looking for signs that the lawman believed him. "That's a serious accusation," Whitmore said when Brennan finished. "But it's also nothing more than hearsay. Even if what you heard is true, it wouldn't hold up in court. Any lawyer worth his salt would tear it apart." "Then get a confession," Brennan pressed. "Arrest Hawkins and his men, question them separately. One of them will crack, especially that Murdoch fellow. He's already half crazy with guilt and fear." Whitmore shook his head. "I can't arrest men based on an overheard conversation, especially when the witness was hiding behind barrels in an alley. Besides, even if I wanted to, I don't have the manpower. It's just me and Billy's barely old enough to shave. Hawkins has at least a dozen men working for him, all of them killers." Brennan felt desperation clawing at his chest. The eastern horizon was growing lighter by the minute, and he could hear the crowd outside growing more impatient for their entertainment. "Then delay the execution. Give me time to find more evidence." "On what grounds?" Whitmore asked. "The territorial judge issued a death warrant. I can't just ignore it because a stranger claims he overheard something suspicious." "The girl is innocent," Brennan said, his voice breaking with emotion. "She's going to die for a crime she didn't commit." Something in his tone must have reached Whitmore, because the sheriff studied him more carefully. "You seem mighty concerned about the fate of an Apache girl you've never met. Why is that, Mr. Brennan?" Brennan hesitated, knowing that revealing his relationship to Ayanna would only complicate matters further. But he was running out of time and options, and desperate situations called for desperate measures. "She's my daughter," he said quietly. The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a gunshot. Whitmore's eyes widened in surprise, and he sank into his chair as if the weight of this revelation had physical force. "Your daughter? How is that possible?" Brennan told him the story quickly. His time as a young soldier, his love affair with Morning Star, his forced departure, and 20 years of searching. As he spoke, he could see the sheriff processing this information, weighing it against what he knew about the case. "Even if that's true," Whitmore said finally, "it doesn't change the evidence against her. She was found with Morrison's body, her hands covered in blood. The arrow was Apache made." "No, it wasn't," Brennan said urgently. "Ayanna told me the arrow was a fake, made to look like Apache work, but constructed incorrectly. The killer wanted it to be found, wanted an Apache to be blamed for the murder." Whitmore frowned. "She never mentioned that during the trial. A translator was a drunk who was more interested in his next bottle than in ensuring accurate communication. Half of what she said was never properly conveyed to the court." The sheriff was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the gallows where his deputy was testing the trapdoor mechanism. When he spoke, His voice was heavy with regret and frustration. "Mr. Brennan, I want to believe you. God knows, I've had doubts about this case from the beginning. But even if everything you've told me is true, I don't have the authority to stop this execution. The warrant was issued by Territorial Judge Morrison, Samuel's brother, as it happens. Even if I wanted to delay the hanging, he would overrule me." Brennan felt the bottom drop out of his world. The judge is the victim's brother. How is that legal? It's not, strictly speaking. But out here, we make do with what we have. Judge Morrison is the only territorial judge within 200 miles, and he wasn't about to recuse himself from his own brother's murder case. "Then the whole trial was a farce," Brennan said, his voice bitter with anger and despair. "Pretty much," Whitmore agreed. "But that doesn't change the fact that your daughter is going to hang in less than an hour, and there's nothing I can do to stop it." Outside, the crowd was growing restless. Someone shouted for the sheriff to bring out the prisoner, and the call was taken up by dozens of voices. The bloodthirsty mob was eager for their entertainment, and they would not be denied much longer. Brennan stared out the window at the gallows, his mind racing through increasingly desperate possibilities. He could try to break Ayanna out of jail, but that would only make them both fugitives. He could attempt to fight his way through the crowd, but he was one man against hundreds. He could try to find Judge Morrison and plead for clemency, but given the man's relationship to the victim, that seemed hopeless. Then an idea struck him, born of desperation and half-remembered legal precedents from his years in business. It was a long shot, probably doomed to failure, but it was the only chance he had left. "Sheriff," he said, turning from the window with renewed urgency, "what do you know about territorial law regarding family claims?" Whitmore looked puzzled. "Family claims? What do you mean? If a condemned person has a blood relative who can prove their relationship, are there any provisions for appeals or delays based on that relationship?" The sheriff scratched his graying head. "I'm not sure. There might be something about notifying next of kin before executions, but I'm no lawyer. Why? Because I am Ayanna's father, and I was never notified of her arrest or trial. According to Territorial Statute 47B, executions cannot proceed without proper notification of immediate family members." Brennan was making up the statute number, but he spoke with such conviction that Whitmore began to look uncertain. The sheriff was a decent man who enforced the law as best he understood it, but his legal education was limited to practical experience rather than formal training. "Even if that's true," Whitmore said slowly, "how would you prove you're her father? You have no documentation, no witnesses." "I have this," Brennan said, pulling out a worn leather wallet. From it, he extracted a yellowed piece of paper, his army discharge papers from 1867. "This proves I was stationed at Fort Apache during the period when Ayanna was conceived. Combined with my knowledge of her mother and specific details about their relationship, it should be enough to establish reasonable doubt about paternity." It was a thin legal thread, but Whitmore seemed to be grasping for any excuse to delay an execution that had troubled him from the beginning. "I'd have to send a telegram to the territorial capital, get a legal opinion from the Attorney General's office. Then send it," Brennan urged. "The law is the law, Sheriff. If there's any doubt about proper procedures being followed, you have a duty to investigate." Outside, the crowd was becoming increasingly agitated. Someone started chanting, "Hang the Apache! Hang the Apache!" And soon dozens of voices had taken up the cry. The bloodlust was reaching a fever pitch, and Brennan knew that if something didn't happen soon, the mob might take matters into their own hands. Whitmore seemed to reach a decision. He moved to his desk and began composing a telegram, his pen scratching across the paper with deliberate precision. "I'm going to request a stay of execution, pending clarification of territorial statutes regarding family notification requirements," he said. "It might buy us a few hours, maybe even a full day." "What about the crowd?" Brennan asked, gesturing toward the window where angry faces were pressed against the glass. "That's going to be the real problem," Whitmore admitted. These people came here expecting to see a hanging, and they're not going to be happy about any delays. Some of them have traveled 50 miles or more for this entertainment. As if summoned by their conversation, the office door burst open and Deputy Billy Cartwright stumbled in, his young face pale with fear. "Sheriff, you need to come quick. The crowd's getting ugly. They're talking about storming the jail if the execution doesn't start soon." Through the window, Brennan could see that the mood of the crowd had indeed turned dangerous. What had started as a grim but orderly gathering was becoming an angry mob. Men were shouting and shaking their fists. Women were crying out for vengeance, and someone had produced a rope separate from the official gallows equipment. "Jesus," Whitmore muttered, grabbing his hat and gun belt. "Billy, get over to the telegraph office and send this message immediately. Mark it urgent and prepaid." "What should I tell the crowd?" Billy asked, his voice cracking with nerves. "Tell them there's been a legal development that requires clarification before the execution can proceed. Tell them to go home and come back tomorrow." Billy looked at his boss as if he had gone insane. "They're not going to accept that, Sheriff. Some of these folks have been drinking all night and they want blood." "Then we'll give them something else to think about," Brennan said grimly. He had been watching the crowd through the window, and he had spotted familiar faces among the agitators. Clem Hawkins and his men were scattered throughout the mob, and they seemed to be doing their best to whip up anger and prevent any delays. "What do you mean?" Whitmore asked. "Hawkins and his gang are out there, stirring up trouble. They want this execution to proceed on schedule, because once Ayanna is dead, the case is closed permanently. But what if we gave the crowd a different target for their anger?" Whitmore's eyes narrowed as he began to understand what Brennan was suggesting. "You want to accuse Hawkins publicly? That's suicide, Mr. Brennan. Him and his boys will gun you down before you can finish the accusation." "Not if you arrest them first," Brennan said. "You said you couldn't arrest them based on what I overheard, but what about the witness who saw them riding toward Morrison's ranch? Your deputy Billy mentioned that someone had provided that information." "Billy," Whitmore called sharply. "Who told you about seeing Hawkins and his men near the Morrison place?" The young deputy looked confused and frightened. It was old Pete from the livery stable. He said he saw them riding out that way around sunset on the night Morrison was killed. But Sheriff, I don't know if Pete would be willing to repeat that in front of Hawkins. You know how those boys are about people who cross them. "Bring Pete here," Whitmore ordered, "right now. And Billy, be careful. If Hawkins or any of his men try to stop you, you fire a warning shot and get back here as fast as you can." As Billy hurried out of the office, Brennan felt a spark of hope for the first time since discovering his daughter's plight. They were still facing enormous odds, but at least they were fighting back instead of simply accepting the inevitable. Outside, the crowd was growing larger and more volatile by the minute. The chant of "Hang the Apache" had been joined by calls for the sheriff to do his job and stop wasting time with legal technicalities. Someone threw a bottle against the jailhouse wall, and the crash of breaking glass sent a shiver through both men. "This is going to get ugly fast," Whitmore observed, checking his revolver and making sure he had extra ammunition. "It's already ugly," Brennan replied, his eyes fixed on the gallows where a noose swayed in the morning breeze. "The question is whether we can make it ugly for the right people." The race against time had begun in earnest, and somewhere in the growing chaos of Crimson Ridge, the truth about Samuel Morrison's murder was about to collide with 20 years of pain, regret, and desperate love. The Apache girl who was to be executed at sunrise had found her father, but whether that discovery would save her life or simply add another tragedy to the brutal arithmetic of frontier justice remained to be seen. The eastern horizon was growing brighter. Dawn was approaching with relentless certainty, and in a cell just 50 yards away, Ayanna clutched her father's locket and prepared to face whatever fate awaited her in the harsh light of the Arizona morning. Final chapter, Dawn of Justice. The first rays of sunlight painted the Arizona sky in shades of crimson and gold as Sheriff Whitmore stepped onto the platform beside the gallows. The crowd of nearly 300 people fell silent, their bloodthirsty anticipation palpable in the morning air. But instead of bringing out the condemned Apache girl, the sheriff held up a yellow telegram that fluttered in the desert breeze. "Ladies and gentlemen," Whitmore announced, his voice carrying across the square, "I have received word from the territorial capital. Due to irregularities in the legal proceedings and new evidence that has come to light, this execution is hereby postponed pending further investigation." The crowd erupted in angry shouts and protests. Bottles and rocks began flying toward the platform, and several men started pushing toward the jail with obvious violent intent. But before the situation could spiral completely out of control, Thomas Brennan stepped forward with Pete Kowalski, the elderly stable owner, at his side. "The new evidence," Brennan called out, his voice somehow cutting through the chaos, "concerns the real killers of Samuel Morrison." The crowd's attention snapped to him like iron filings to a magnet. Even the most violent agitators paused to hear what this well-dressed stranger had to say. Pete here saw Clem Hawkins and his gang riding toward the Morrison Ranch on the night of the murder, Brennan continued. "The same Clem Hawkins who's been running protection rackets throughout this territory, demanding money from honest ranchers and killing those who refuse to pay." All eyes turned to where Hawkins stood near the back of the crowd, his hand resting on his gun butt. His face had gone pale, but his voice was steady when he replied, "That's a damned lie. I was in the saloon all that night, and plenty of folks can vouch for me." "Then explain this," Sheriff Whitmore said, holding up an Apache arrow that looked identical to the one found in Morrison's chest. "We found this in your saddlebags, along with several others just like it. Seems you've been collecting Apache arrows for some time, probably planning to use them to frame innocent people for your crimes." The evidence had actually been planted by Deputy Billy, who had retrieved the arrows from a trading post where Hawkins was known to frequent. But the crowd didn't need to know that detail. Hawkins's composure finally cracked. "You can't prove nothing. That Apache girl was found with Morrison's blood on her hands because she tried to help him after you shot him," Brennan shot back. "She found him dying and attempted to save his life, which is why she was covered in blood when your men arrived to finish the job and plant the evidence." The crowd was beginning to turn, their anger shifting from the absent Apache girl to the very present Clem Hawkins. Several of Morrison's friends and fellow ranchers stepped forward, their faces dark with newfound understanding. "You killed Sam Morrison," one of them accused. "You killed him because he wouldn't pay your blood money." Hawkins reached for his gun, but he was surrounded by hundreds of angry people who had just realized they had been manipulated. Before he could clear leather, a dozen hands grabbed him, wrestling the weapon away and pinning his arms behind his back. "Jake Murdoch!" Whitmore called out. "Where's Jake Murdoch?" But Murdoch was already running, his nerve having finally broken completely. He made it less than 50 yards before the crowd caught him, their mob mentality now focused on the real criminals instead of an innocent Apache girl. Within an hour, Hawkins and 3 of his gang members were locked in the same cells that had held Ayanna. Under intense questioning and faced with overwhelming evidence, Murdoch broke down and confessed everything. Morrison had indeed been killed for refusing to pay protection money, and the Apache arrow had been planted to frame a convenient scapegoat. As the sun climbed higher in the desert sky, Thomas Brennan sat in Ayanna's cell, holding his daughter's hand for the first time in her life. She was free, her name cleared, but 22 years of separation could not be erased in a single morning. "What happens now?" she asked quietly, still clutching the silver locket he had given her. "Now we have time," Brennan replied. "Time to know each other, time to heal old wounds, time to build the relationship we should have had all along." "I have nothing in the white man's world," Ayanna said. "No place, no people who claim me as their own." "You have me," Brennan said firmly. "And I have money, property, influence. We can go anywhere, do anything. The choice is yours." Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, considering this unexpected gift of freedom and family. "I would like to see the sacred mountains again," she said finally. "The places where my mother walked, where my grandmother sang her healing songs. Will you come with me? I'll go wherever you want to go, Brennan promised. I've spent 20 years searching for you. I'm not about to let you out of my sight now. 3 days later, father and daughter rode out of Crimson Ridge together, leaving behind the gallows that had nearly claimed an innocent life. Behind them, Clem Hawkins awaited his own appointment with the hangman's rope, while the territorial government launched a full investigation into the protection racket that had terrorized honest ranchers for years. The Apache girl, who was to have been executed at sunrise, had found not only her freedom, but her father, and perhaps most importantly, her future. In the vast expanse of the Arizona Territory, where the desert stretched endlessly toward distant mountains, two people who had been strangers at dawn were now family, bound together by blood, sacrifice, and the kind of love that can survive even 20 years of separation. The morning that had begun with the promise of death had become the dawn of a new life, and as they rode toward the sacred mountains where Morning Star had once walked, both father and daughter knew that some stories, no matter how painful their beginning, can still have happy endings. Justice had prevailed, truth had conquered lies, and in the harsh beauty of the American frontier, a family torn apart by circumstance and time had finally been made whole again. The sun that had risen on a planned execution now shone down on redemption, reunion, and the beginning of a relationship that would last for the rest of their lives. The Apache girl lived, the real killers faced justice, and somewhere in the desert wind that sang through the canyons and mesas of Arizona Territory, the spirit of Morning Star smiled down on her daughter and the man she had loved, finally together at last.